In the year 1170, the midday sun pierces Jerusalem with golden spears of light. Beyond the walls of the royal palace, built by the Crusaders on ancient foundations, the multilingual hive of the Holy City buzzes with life. The air trembles with a mixture of languages, the clang of weapons, and street prayers. The scents of incense and expensive spices intertwine with the pungent stench of filth. Jerusalem is a city of absolute contrasts, but in the cool tranquility of its citadel, a unique drama is unfolding. Far from the city's hustle and bustle, in the cool tranquility of the gardens, 9-year-old Prince Baldwin, son of King Amalric, plays with his peers. Energetic and carefree as young falcons, the sons of barons are engrossed in their game. It seems the heir's childhood is utterly cloudless, but this idyllic scene is already being watched by one who will give it a different, tragic meaning. The prince's tutor, Archdeacon William of Tyre, watches the rough, boyish game with warmth. A future great chronicler, a man of insight and learning, he has long noted in his charge a maturity beyond his years and a lively mind. In this boy, now fighting with wooden swords, he sees a future monarch. But one detail in their play will soon draw his troubled attention. William of Tyre notices something strange. In the heat of the game, the boys scratch each other's forearms, and all but Baldwin flinch and cry out in pain. The fair-haired, gray-eyed prince endures all scratches with a stoicism beyond his years. This strange indifference to pain at first brings only a smile to his tutor's face, but it will soon be replaced by anxiety. Initially, William attributes the boy's fortitude to the exceptional bravery characteristic of the blood of the Angevin dynasty. But the scene repeats itself day after day, and the anxiety, at first like a grain of sand in a shoe, grows into a sharp, cold stone in the scholar's soul. This unease becomes unbearable, and one day after the game, the tutor decides to call the prince over to put an end to his doubts. Trying to make his voice sound as casual as possible, William takes the boy's right hand, which was most often struck, and runs his finger over it. He asks if the prince feels any pain. Baldwin, without a hint of bravado or pretense, simply replies that he feels nothing. This answer becomes a terrible confirmation of the tutor's worst fears. In that moment, for William of Tyre, the sunlight dims, and the singing of birds sounds like a funeral dirge. He had studied not only the Holy Scriptures, but also the works of ancient physicians, and so he immediately recognized the symptom. Behind this children's game and innocent answer lay a death sentence, and the tutor understood it. His world was turned upside down in an instant, for the diagnosis was obvious. The absence of pain in his limbs was not a sign of strength, but a harbinger of a curse that in those days was considered more terrible than any war. It was the finger of God, a punishment for the sins of ancestors, a slow and inevitable death in life. It was leprosy. The name of this disease sounded like a sentence for the entire kingdom, doomed to perish along with its future ruler. That day, an invisible crown of martyrdom descended upon the 9-year-old boy's head, predetermining his fate. He was destined to become one of the most tragic and great monarchs in history, whose name would be inscribed in the annals of unbending will. This is the story of how a dying young man saved an entire kingdom, becoming the last bright flash of the sunset of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. His name is Baldwin IV, the Leper King. To understand the greatness and tragedy of Baldwin, one must look at the world in which he was to rule. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in the mid-12th century was not a state, but rather a mirage, an island of the Christian West in the heart of the Islamic world. Born of the fanatical faith, greed, and desperate courage of the warriors of the First Crusade, it fought a desperate struggle for survival every day, literally living on a volcano. The very foundation of this state, which the Europeans called outre-mer, was an act of monstrous cruelty. The capture of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099 turned into a massacre, about which the eyewitness Raymond of Aguilera wrote that the streets were flooded with blood up to the ankles. This bloody beginning left its mark on its entire short history. The first rulers, Godfrey of Bouillon and his brother Baldwin I, faced a colossal task. They had to hold a thin strip of land from Beirut to Gaza, surrounded by hostile emirates and sultanates dreaming of reclaiming Al-Quds, the holy city of Jerusalem. The task of holding power in such conditions was practically impossible. The top of the social pyramid of this state was composed of the Franks, descendants of crusaders from France, England, Germany, and Italy. But this ruling minority was catastrophically small in number. There were no more than 150,000 knights, barons, clergy, and merchants in all the lands of the Crusader states. They were but a drop in the ocean of another people. The bulk of the population consisted of local inhabitants, Eastern Christians, Syriac Jacobites, Armenian Monophysites, Orthodox Greeks, and Muslims, Arabs, and Seljuk Turks. Muslims were tolerated as a labor force, subject to a special tax for their faith, but they were not trusted. This society was divided and extremely unstable from within. Governing this multinational and multi-confessional cauldron required both military strength and diplomatic flexibility. However, the Franks often lacked diplomacy, and their military power, paradoxically, was both their main strength and their main weakness, constantly putting the kingdom on the brink of ruin. The basis of the army was a feudal levy, where each baron provided soldiers. The core of this force was a few hundred heavily armed knights, the elite of medieval warfare, clad in steel on powerful war horses. But these forces were completely insufficient to simultaneously control the borders and keep the local population in check. The kingdom catastrophically lacked its own army. A colossal role in the defense was played by the military religious orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers. These warrior monks, who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicated their lives to holy war. It was they, the Order of the Poor Knights of Christ and the Order of the Hospital of St. John, who became the main defense of the fragile state, its hope and support. The orders were, in fact, the first regular army in history, subordinate not to the king, but directly to the Pope. Their knights were the most disciplined and experienced warriors, and their fortresses, such as Croix des Chevaliers, were the most powerful. But this independence and wealth made them not only a pillar of defense, but also a dangerous internal political force, capable of challenging the crown. The kingdom's economy rested on two pillars: agriculture, where fertile lands yielded grain, olives, and sugarcane, and above all, transit trade. Port cities such as Acre and Tyre became Europe's gateways to the east, bringing colossal wealth to the treasury and creating an illusion of prosperity. This trade was controlled by the Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa. They provided the fleet for transporting troops and assisting in sieges, receiving in return entire quarters in cities and exemption from taxes. However, their commercial interests often conflicted with the military goals of the kingdom, creating another knot of internal contradictions. The political system was a copy of European feudalism, where the king was merely the first among equals. His power was limited by the haute cour, a council of powerful barons and clergy. Any important decision, be it a declaration of war, the conclusion of peace, or the imposition of a tax, required their consent. The king was not an absolute monarch. His hands were tied. Such a system gave rise to constant intrigue and power struggles, especially under a weak or underage monarch. The golden age of the kingdom was coming to an end. A new, formidable power was already rising in the east, and it was into this unstable world, on the verge of great upheavals, that on November 13th, 1161, Baldwin was born, the second child and first son of King Amalric and Agnes of Courtenay. The story of Baldwin's parents, King Amalric and Agnes of Courtenay, itself reflects all the vices and passions of the Jerusalem court. Their union, which began as a love story, turned into a political scandal and left a deep scar on the future of the kingdom. It is in this family drama that the origins of many future troubles lie. Baldwin's father, Amalric, was the second son of King Fulk of Anjou and was not born to the throne. He grew up in the shadow of his older brother, the future Baldwin III, and received the county of Jaffa and Ascalon, the most important but also the most dangerous fief on the border with Egypt, under constant threat. Amalric was not the main heir, but fate had a different role in store for him. Amalric was the complete opposite of his charming and generous brother. Tall, stately, but with a slight stutter, he was reserved, stingy, but also curious and passionate about the study of law and history. The chronicler William of Tyre noted that Amalric was a skilled warrior and a far-sighted politician, but at the same time excessively fond of carnal pleasures, which made his personality extremely contradictory. In 1157, Amalric made a controversial choice by marrying Agnes of Courtenay. She was the daughter of the last Count of Edessa, the easternmost outpost of the Crusaders, which fell in 1144. This fall provoked the failed Second Crusade and forever linked the Courtenay family with the shadow of defeat. His wife was from a fallen and disgraced lineage. The Courtenay family had lost everything, and Agnes, belonging to one of the noblest families, arrived in Jerusalem without a dowry. Dazzlingly beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious, she was, according to chroniclers, utterly unscrupulous. A trail of rumors about licentiousness, greed, and a lust for power followed her. Agnes had a terrible reputation, but that did not stop the future king. Agnes's beauty and charm captivated Amalric. He married her, ignoring the fact that they shared a great-grandfather, which by the canons of the church made their marriage illegitimate. While his older brother was alive, this was overlooked. Agnes bore him a daughter, Sibylla, and then a son, Baldwin. But their union was vulnerable from the start. In 1162, King Baldwin III died suddenly in Beirut, and the throne passed to Amalric. Agnes's enemies immediately seized the opportunity, and the question of the legitimacy of the new king's marriage was raised with full force. His brother's death changed everything, forcing Amalric to make a fateful choice on which the fate of both his family and the entire kingdom depended. The haute cour of barons gave Amalric an ultimatum. They would recognize him as king only if he annulled the marriage. The barons feared the strengthening of the Courtenay clan. They were outraged by Agnes's reputation, and the patriarch insisted on the illegitimacy of the union. Hatred for her united all factions, and Amalric had to choose between love and power. Amalric chose the crown. The marriage was annulled, and Agnes was removed from the court, although she retained her title and financial support. But the cruelest condition of the divorce was that their children, Sibylla and Baldwin, though recognized as legitimate heirs, were separated from their mother. He chose power, but for its sake, he sacrificed his family, condemning his children to be orphans while their mother was still alive. The separation from his mother left a deep mark on the future king's character. 1-year-old Baldwin remained at his father's court in the care of tutors, while his sister Sibylla was sent to the convent of St. Lazarus in Bethany. He grew up in an atmosphere of intrigue, where his mother's name was either silenced or spoken with contempt. His childhood was traumatic from the very beginning. Agnes, however, did not disappear from the political scene. She made advantageous marriages, first to the powerful Hugh of Ibelin, and after his death, to Renaud, Lord of Sidon. She remained an influential figure, weaving intrigues and creating her own party at court, patiently waiting for the hour when she could return and exert influence over her crowned children. As king, Amalric proved to be an energetic ruler. He focused all his efforts on what he saw as the main threat, Egypt, weakened by internal strife. His Egyptian adventure, 5 military campaigns into the Nile Valley, with the aim of conquering or subduing this rich land, became the leitmotif of his entire reign. Ultimately, these costly and bloody campaigns proved unsuccessful. They drained the treasury and military resources of the kingdom, but worst of all, they led to the exact opposite result that Amalric had so desperately tried to avoid. His Egyptian adventure turned into a strategic catastrophe. Amalric's intervention in Egyptian affairs provoked the Syrian ruler Nur al-Din to send his best commander, the Kurd Shirkuh, to the Nile Valley. With him went his young but talented nephew, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, who was destined to go down in history under the name Salah al-Din, or Saladin. As a result of a complex struggle, having eliminated both the Fatimid viziers and his own uncle, Saladin became the de facto ruler of Egypt in 1169. Thus, by the time William of Tyre discovered young Baldwin's terrible disease, the geopolitical situation for the Kingdom of Jerusalem had already become absolutely catastrophic. Instead of 2 weakened enemies to the north and south, the Franks found themselves caught in a steel grip. Egypt and Syria were now united under the rule of one ruler, Nur al-Din, whose viceroy in Cairo was the young and ambitious genius, Saladin. The sword of jihad, the holy war for the return of Jerusalem, hung over the kingdom. The kingdom was completely surrounded. There was no unity within the state either. The court was torn apart by 2 factions. The party of local barons, led by Raymond of Tripoli, advocated for flexible diplomacy and alliances with the Muslims. They were opposed by the court party, consisting of newly arrived knights and supporters of uncompromising war, such as the king's mother, Agnes of Courtenay. The Jerusalem nobility was split into hawks and doves. Baldwin grew up in this atmosphere of constant intrigue, deprived of a mother's affection. His father Amalric, trying to strengthen the dynasty, married for a second time to the Byzantine princess Maria Komnena. This marriage brought the kingdom an alliance with Byzantium, but also created a new line of succession in the person of their daughter Isabella, which only added fuel to the fire of the future struggle for power. The news of the prince's leprosy became a terrible state secret, which William of Tyre reported to King Amalric. The kingdom was like a ship in a stormy sea, with cracks in its hull and a feuding crew on board. And the captain of this doomed vessel was to be a sick boy who could not feel the pain in his right hand. The fate of the kingdom was in the hands of a sick child. In the 12th century, leprosy was considered not just a disease, but a punishment from God and a social stigma. Lepers, the living dead, were cast out of society, forced to wear bells. The thought that the heir to the throne carried this mark was monstrous. Enemies could use it as proof that God had turned away from the ruling house. The disease was a political catastrophe. The diagnosis was kept in the strictest secrecy. The best doctors, both Frankish and Arab, were summoned, but their ointments, baths, and diets were of no help. The disease progressed slowly but surely. And then King Amalric, seeing the futility of the doctor's efforts, made a fateful decision that would define the rest of his son's life. Instead of hiding the sick heir or depriving him of his right to the throne, Amalric ordered his education to be intensified. He decided to prepare his son to rule, ignoring the disease, perhaps hoping for a miracle, or perhaps already seeing in the boy that incredible strength of spirit that would later amaze the world. They decided to prepare him to be king, no matter what. Under the guidance of William of Tyre, the young prince showed remarkable intellectual abilities. He studied Latin, law, and history, possessing a phenomenal memory and a sharp mind. As his tutor wrote, Baldwin developed his innate talents more and more each day, preferring stories of his ancestors' deeds to all other studies. He was a brilliant student, absorbing knowledge. However, in the art of war, Baldwin faced an insurmountable obstacle. The progressive disease weakened his right arm and leg, taking away his sensitivity. For a knight whose life depended on his ability to wield a sword, a lance, and control a horse, this was tantamount to a death sentence. The disease prevented him from being a warrior, but he found his own way. It was during this period of desperate struggle with physical infirmity that Baldwin's legendary character began to form. He refused to give up. He learned everything a knight was supposed to learn, but he did it differently, finding a way to compensate for his growing weakness. Unable to hold the reins firmly with his right hand, he learned to control a horse solely with the strength of his legs. Training for hours, he perfected this skill, gripping the animal's sides with such power that he amazed even experienced warriors. The horse became an extension of his body, obedient to his will. He became a brilliant rider despite his ailment. The sword was more difficult. His weakening right hand did not allow for powerful strikes. Baldwin compensated for this with courage and tactical thinking. He realized that his main strength was not in his muscles, but in his ability to lead, inspire, and make split-second decisions on the battlefield. His mind became his main weapon. He became a strategist, not just a fighter. The daily struggle with his own body forged his will. While other boys learned to wield weapons, he learned from childhood to control himself, to endure pain, and to hide his suffering. This inner discipline and an unbreakable core, like tempered steel, commanded the astonishment and respect of the harsh barons, who saw in the fragile youth a true leader. King Amalric, convinced of the correctness of his decision, began to take his son to meetings of the haute cour. He introduced him to the barons, initiated him into the subtleties of diplomacy and state administration. The young prince absorbed everything, preparing to accept the crown. His father personally taught him the art of ruling, passing on his experience and knowledge. Watching his father navigate between warring factions, powerful vassals like the Templars and Hospitallers, and external forces such as Byzantium, Baldwin learned to understand people. He grasped their hidden motives and interests, receiving invaluable lessons in real, not textbook politics, which was far more complex and dangerous. In 1174, when Baldwin was only 13, his education was abruptly cut short. King Amalric, returning from a campaign, fell ill with dysentery. Feeling death approaching and realizing that the doctors were powerless, he convened the haute cour and officially proclaimed his sick son the sole heir to the throne of Jerusalem. On the 11th of July, 1174, King Amalric died. The kingdom held its breath in anxious anticipation. A 13-year-old boy, whose terrible disease was no longer a secret to the top nobility, was to ascend the throne. The state was left with a sick child at its head at the most dangerous moment in its history. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the enemy was at the gates. Just a few months before Amalric's death, the Syrian ruler Nur al-Din also died. His legacy, a united Syria and Egypt, was passing into the hands of the far more formidable and determined Saladin. The enemy had grown stronger at the most inopportune moment. It seemed that the fate of the kingdom, in the hands of a teenager doomed to a slow death, was sealed. Few could have imagined that it would be this sick boy who would postpone the fall of the state at the cost of inhuman suffering and give it a final decade of glory, writing his name into legend. 4 days after his father's death, on July 15, 1174, the sacred day of the anniversary of the capture of Jerusalem, Baldwin was crowned in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. But behind the magnificent ceremony lay anxiety. As they swore allegiance, the barons scrutinized the new king's face, trying to discern the signs of the terrible disease. At that moment, the disease had not yet greatly disfigured him. He was tall and slender, having inherited his mother's delicate features and his father's fair hair. But an experienced eye could already notice a slight asymmetry and puffiness of the skin, the first signs of what would eventually turn into the horrifying lion's face, characteristic of the lepromatous form of leprosy. The disease was already noticeable. Since the king was a minor, the question of a regency immediately arose. The first to take power was the Seneschal Miles of Plancy, an influential but arrogant and greedy baron who had recently arrived from France. He despised the local aristocrats, and his rule caused general discontent from the very beginning. Miles's arrogance turned the entire nobility against him, and the leader of the opposition became Raymond III, Count of Tripoli, a representative of an ancient family, the great-grandson of one of the leaders of the First Crusade and the king's closest relative. He was one of the most significant and controversial figures of the era. The regent had a powerful and dangerous enemy. Raymond was an experienced warrior and a subtle diplomat. Having spent almost 10 years in Muslim captivity, he spoke fluent Arabic and had a perfect understanding of the enemy's mentality. He was a proponent of a pragmatic policy, believing that the kingdom could survive only by maneuvering and forming temporary alliances, which earned him the hatred of the war party. The conflict between Miles and Raymond grew, and the young Baldwin was merely an observer of this struggle. Sitting in the meetings of the haute cour, he listened to the disputes and learned his first bitter lesson of royal power. The personal ambitions of the barons were often placed above the interests of the state. He learned from others' mistakes, preparing for his own rule. The denouement came quickly and was bloody. In the autumn of 1174, Miles of Plancy was stabbed to death in a narrow street in Acre. The murderers were never found, but everyone knew who was behind it. The path to the regency was cleared, and the haute cour promptly appointed Raymond as bailli. He had eliminated his rival and seized power. Thus began the period of Raymond's regency, which lasted for 2 years, until Baldwin came of age at 15. The Count of Tripoli proved to be a wise and cautious ruler, whose main task was to provide the kingdom with a peaceful respite, so necessary before the coming storms. Raymond understood that fighting Saladin, who was busy subduing Syria at the time, was suicidal. He concluded a truce with him, which enraged the war party. The hotheads, such as Reynald of Châtillon and the Grand Master of the Templars, considered any treaty with the Saracens a disgrace. but the regent was thinking of the kingdom's survival. These 2 years became a real school of governance for Baldwin. Unlike Miles, Raymond treated the young king with respect and involved him in the discussion of all important issues. Baldwin watched as the regent conducted negotiations, managed finances, and resolved disputes, mastering the science of power not in theory, but in practice. It was during this period that Baldwin began to form his circle of trusted associates. He brought his maternal uncle, the loyal and devoted Jocelyn of Courtenay, closer. He appointed his teacher, William of Tyre, as chancellor. He also maintained the best of relations with the powerful Ibelin clan, in whom he saw the embodiment of knightly honor. He began to assemble his team. The most important issue was planning the king's future marriage. An heir was as necessary as heir, but everyone understood that the marriage would be childless and the line doomed. Who would agree to marry their daughter to a leper monarch? This tragic and insoluble problem forced the court to seek another solution for the continuation of the dynasty. In this connection, negotiations began for the marriage of Baldwin's sister, Sibylla, who was next in line of succession. Her husband could become the future ruler, and William of Montferrat, nicknamed Longsword, was chosen as her suitor. A representative of a powerful European family, he seemed an ideal match, capable of bringing aid from the west to the kingdom. In 1176, Baldwin turned 15, and Raymond's regency officially ended. The young man, whose body already bore clear marks of the disease and whose hands were weakening with each passing day, assumed full power. He understood that the truce was only a lull before the storm, and that the main test of his right to wear the crown was not far off. It is impossible to understand Baldwin's reign without turning to the personality of his great antagonist. Their confrontation was not just a conflict of religions or states. It was a duel between 2 outstanding individuals. The young Christian king, consumed from within by disease, and the mature Muslim Sultan, consumed by the fire of a holy war for the return of Jerusalem. Saladin was a Kurd, born in 1137 to a family of warriors in the service of the Seljuk Turks. In his youth, he showed no interest in military affairs, was a quiet, thoughtful young man, and studying the Quran, was preparing for a career as a scholar. Nothing foreshadowed his fame as the greatest commander of the Islamic world. In his youth, he was a scholar, not a warrior. Everything changed when his uncle Shirkuh, sent by order of Nur al-Din to Egypt, took his 26-year-old nephew with him. It was there, in the crucible of brutal intrigues and battles for power at the court of the Fatimid dynasty, that Saladin's hidden genius was revealed. He proved to be a brave warrior, a brilliant tactician, and an unsurpassed master of the political game. After the sudden death of his uncle in 1169, Saladin inherited his post as vizier of Egypt. Acting swiftly and decisively, he dealt with the opposition, reorganized the army and the economy. Formerly remaining a vassal of Nur al-Din, who ruled from Damascus, he effectively became the absolute ruler of Egypt with its colossal resources. In 1174, almost simultaneously with the death of King Amalric, Saladin's overlord, Nur al-Din also died. His empire began to crumble, and for Saladin, this was a turning point. He saw in the ensuing chaos an opportunity given by Allah himself, a chance to begin the unification of the entire Islamic world under his hand. The death of his suzerain opened the way for him to the pinnacle of power. Saladin's finest hour had come. Proclaiming himself the protector of Nur al-Din's young heir and the continuer of the cause of jihad, under this plausible pretext, he moved his troops into Syria. In November 1174, he entered Damascus without a fight, where he was hailed as a liberator. He began his great campaign to unite the Muslim lands. Having subdued Hama and Homs, he encountered resistance from the powerful Aleppo, where the young heir had taken refuge. Opponents accused Saladin of betrayal and usurpation, reproaching him for fighting Muslims instead of infidels. He did not have universal support and had to prove his right to leadership. And here Saladin proved himself to be a brilliant propagandist. Surrounding himself with theologians and poets, he created the image of an ascetic, just, and pious fighter for the faith. Leading a modest lifestyle, being generous to his warriors and ruthless to his enemies, he became not just a military leader, but a symbol of Islamic revival, sent to liberate Jerusalem. His war machine was one of the best in the East. The core of the army was the professional Mamluk cavalry, warrior slaves of Turkic origin, excellent horsemen and archers. Their tactic, to shower the enemy with arrows and avoid direct confrontation, was deadly for the heavy Frankish knightly cavalry. Saladin was a master of mobile warfare, swift raids, and long sieges. By 1176, when Baldwin assumed full power, he was already the ruler of a huge empire that included Egypt and most of Syria. His state surrounded the Crusader Kingdom, and he was only gathering his strength, waiting for a convenient moment to strike. His main goal and life's work were clear and unwavering from the very beginning. It was the expulsion of the Franks from the Holy Land and the return of Jerusalem, the third holiest city in Islam, to the rule of the crescent moon. For Saladin, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was not just an enemy state, but a thorn in the very heart of the Islamic world. Al-Quds, the city from which, according to tradition, the Prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven, was in the hands of the infidels, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque had been turned into the headquarters of the Templars. The return of the city was his sacred religious duty. Baldwin and his advisors watched Saladin's rise with growing anxiety. They understood that a clash with the most formidable military force the Middle East had seen in 100 years was inevitable. The only question was where and when the Sultan would strike. The small, strife-torn kingdom was about to face a genius of war and politics. The autumn of 1177 went down in history as the moment of truth for the 16-year-old Baldwin. It was then that he had to prove to everyone, and above all to himself, that he was a true king, warrior, and protector, despite the disease consuming his flesh. The hour of the greatest trial of his life had come. It all began with a strategic mistake. Philip, Count of Flanders, arrived in the Holy Land, and instead of helping to defend the south, he and the main forces of the kingdom went north to attack Syrian cities. As a result, the southern borders of the state were left almost defenseless, opening the way for the enemy to Jerusalem. Saladin could not miss such an opportunity. Confident that the moment to strike had come, he gathered a huge army of up to 30,000 warriors and invaded the kingdom from Egypt. His plan was audacious, a direct strike on Jerusalem. He believed that he was opposed only by a small garrison led by a sick boy king. The news of the invasion threw Jerusalem into a panic. It seemed that all was lost. But it was at this moment that the young Baldwin showed his iron will. He refused to sit out a siege and announced the gathering of all available forces for an immediate march to meet the enemy. The king decided to give battle, despite the monstrous inequality of forces. His army was ridiculously small. Under the king's banners stood only about 375 knights, including 80 Templars and a few thousand infantrymen. The total number of troops did not exceed 6,000 men. It was the army of David going against the countless hordes of Goliath, and the outcome of the battle seemed a foregone conclusion. Among the knights were legendary figures, the Ibelin brothers and Reynald of Châtillon. Baldwin himself, overcoming the pain, insisted on personally leading the army. And the warriors were inspired by the greatest relic of the Christian world, a piece of the true cross, which was carried before the army by the Bishop of Bethlehem. The Crusader army moved towards Ascalon, the last major fortress on Saladin's path to Jerusalem. In a desperate forced march, they managed to enter the city just under the nose of the Muslim vanguard, buying precious time and an opportunity to rest. Saladin, confident in his overwhelming superiority, made a fatal mistake. He did not besiege Ascalon, considering the detachment trapped there to be of no danger, and moved on towards the capital, allowing his warriors to plunder the surroundings. As a result, his huge army was stretched out for many kilometers and lost all battle order. Baldwin had no intention of sitting in a siege. Waiting for this moment, he made a daring sortie, broke through the screen left by Saladin, and gave chase. On November 25, 1177, at the hill of Montgisard, near the town of Ramla, the small Crusader army caught up with the relaxed and unprepared army of the Sultan. The Muslim army was taken by surprise. Stretched out, burdened with booty and prisoners, they did not expect an attack. When the banners of the Franks appeared on the horizon, they at first did not believe their eyes. But it was already too late to do anything. Saladin's army was not ready for battle before. What happened next became the stuff of legends. The young king, his face shining with determination, dismounted and fell prostrate before the peace of the Holy Cross, praying for victory. Rising, he gave the order, and the small army, like a coiled steel spring, fell upon the disorganized mass of the enemy. The legendary charge began. In the vanguard, sweeping away everything in their path, rode the Templar cavalry. Next to them, in the thick of the battle, fought Baldwin himself. On that day, the disease seemed to recede from him, and he fought like a lion, inspiring his warriors to incredible feats with his example. The king personally led his army in a suicidal but glorious attack. The blow was of such force and fury that Saladin's huge army wavered and fled. His elite Mamluks, caught by surprise, did not have time to use their tactic of shooting from bows and were drawn into close combat, where the heavily armed Frankish knight had no equal. A slaughter began. Saladin's army was completely routed. The defeat was total. Saladin's personal guard, consisting of 1,000 of the best Mamluks, was almost completely destroyed. The Sultan himself barely escaped, fleeing on a fast camel. The remnants of his once formidable army were cut down during the panicked retreat to Egypt. Saladin returned to Cairo with the pathetic remains of his guard, having suffered the most devastating defeat of his life. Baldwin IV and his handful of heroes returned to Jerusalem in triumph. The 16-year-old Leper King, who had achieved the impossible, instantly became a living legend throughout the Christian world. He proved that the power of the Spirit can conquer any infirmity of the flesh, and that a handful of brave men, fighting for their faith and their land, can overcome countless hordes. The victory at Montgisard gave the kingdom almost 10 years of peace and security. It took Saladin years to rebuild his army and reputation. For Baldwin, this was the peak of his glory. But while the hero king celebrated his victory, new intrigues were already brewing in the snake pit of the Jerusalem court, which would prove to be more terrible than any enemy invasion. The victory did not solve the internal problems. The main problem once again became the issue of succession. The king's illness was progressing, and it was obvious to everyone that he would not live long and would not leave a direct heir. The eyes of the entire nobility turned to his older sister, Sibylla. Her hand became the main prize in a cruel political game that would eventually lead the state to the brink of the abyss. Sibylla was the complete opposite of her sensible and restrained brother. Passionate, impulsive, and easily influenced, she had inherited her mother Agnes's beauty and lust for power. Despite the years spent in a convent, she longed for secular life and power, which made her a dangerous and unpredictable figure in this complex game. Her first husband, William Longsword, who had seemed an ideal match, arrived in the kingdom in 1176. However, just a few months after the wedding, he fell ill with malaria and died, leaving Sibylla pregnant. She gave birth to a son, whom she named Baldwin. This boy, the future Baldwin V, became the nominal heir to the throne, but the kingdom needed an adult ruler. The search for a new husband for Sibylla became an arena for the clash of two factions. The party of local barons, led by the Ibelins and Raymond of Tripoli, sought their own candidate. They were opposed by the court party, led by the king's mother, Agnes. Her circle included her brother Jocelyn, the Grand Master of the Templars Gérard de Riedfort, and the odious Reynald of Châtillon. In 1180, Guy of Lusignan arrived in the Holy Land, a young and handsome but untalented and low-born knight from Poitou. His reputation at home was questionable. He had been exiled for the murder of an English king's nobleman. This man possessed neither wealth nor ability, but he had a handsome face. Sibylla fell head over heels in love with the handsome foreigner, and her mother, Agnes of Courtenay, saw in him the ideal, weak, and controllable puppet through whom she could rule the kingdom. She and her party began to actively promote his candidacy for the role of husband to the heir of the throne. Baldwin IV, whose condition was steadily deteriorating, was at first categorically against this union. He understood that Guy was an empty and insignificant man, incapable of ruling. But he was under immense pressure. His sister begged him, his mother whispered advice, and the entire court party wove a web of intrigue around him. Worn out by illness and intrigue, Baldwin feared that his opponents, led by Raymond and the Ibelins, would stage a coup and force Sibylla to marry their candidate. Fearing a split and a civil war that the weakened kingdom might not survive, he made the biggest and most tragic mistake of his life. He yielded to the pressure. On Easter 1180, he gave his consent to the marriage of Sibylla and Guy of Lusignan. The wise chronicler William of Tyre wrote with bitterness about that day, wondering how such a noble lady could be given in marriage to a man not famed for either prudence or valor. It was a black day for the kingdom of Jerusalem. The consequences were immediate. Having become the king's brother-in-law, Guy showed his true colors. He was arrogant, incompetent, and completely under the influence of his wife and the court clique. The split in the kingdom deepened. The old aristocracy, led by Raymond of Tripoli and the Ibelins, openly despised the new favorite and refused to obey him. Baldwin watched in horror as his kingdom fell apart from within, but his physical strength was failing. Leprosy had entered the next stage. He began to lose his sight. Ulcers appeared on his hands and feet, and soon he had to be carried on a litter. The king weakened along with his kingdom, unable to undo what he had done. In 1182, during a new invasion by Saladin, Baldwin was so weak that he could not lead the army. He was forced to appoint Guy of Lusignan as regent and commander-in-chief, and he immediately demonstrated his complete military and political incompetence, bringing the kingdom to the brink of disaster. Having gathered a huge Crusader army at the Springs of Galilee, Guy confronted Saladin's army but showed cowardice and indecision. He stood his ground for several days, allowing the enemy to plunder the lands unhindered, and then retreated in disgrace without giving battle. The army was furious, and Guy's reputation as a commander was completely destroyed. When news of the disgrace reached Baldwin, his anger was terrible. Despite his infirmity, he found the strength to act. He immediately dismissed Guy from the regency and command and tried to force Sibylla to divorce him. But the stubborn and infatuated sister flatly refused, putting her feelings above the fate of the kingdom. Then the dying king took a desperate step. To prevent his hated brother-in-law from coming to power after his death, he decided to crown his 5-year-old nephew, Sibylla's son from her first marriage, Baldwin V, during his lifetime. In November 1183, an unprecedented ceremony took place in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. A tragic and magnificent scene unfolded. The infirm, blind, and ulcer-covered Baldwin IV was carried into the church on a litter and placed next to the throne. Next to him stood the little boy, his heir. The patriarch placed the crown on the child's head, proclaiming him king. Then, in complete silence, Baldwin IV, gathering his last strength, raised himself on the litter and personally placed a second, larger crown on his nephew's head, symbolizing the transfer of power from one monarch to another. This gesture showed everyone that, despite his infirmity, he was still king, and his will was law. The dying lion was passing on his legacy to a lion cub surrounded by a pack of jackals. He appointed Raymond of Tripoli as regent for the young king, his longtime opponent, but the only one he could now trust. Guy of Lusignan was completely removed. It seemed that at the last moment, Baldwin had managed to save the kingdom from the consequences of his own mistake. By the end of 1183, Baldwin was only 22 years old, but the disease had turned him into a ruin. He was blind, his limbs were mutilated by ulcers, he could not walk, and every movement caused excruciating pain. But in his fading body, the indomitable fire of royal duty still burned, and fate gave him one last chance to prove it. Saladin, seeing the internal strife in the kingdom and Guy's passivity, decided that the time had come for a new strike. This time his target was one of the most important fortresses in Transjordan, Kerak of Moab, or Kerak. The Sultan went on the offensive again, choosing a point of attack that was extremely painful for the Franks. The owner of the castle was Reynold of Châtillon, the man most hated by Saladin in the kingdom. Treacherous, cruel, and greedy, he had repeatedly broken truces, plundered caravans, and tortured prisoners. Saladin had personally sworn to cut off his head, and now he had a chance to fulfill his oath. In the autumn of 1183, Saladin laid siege to Kerak. The occasion was significant. The wedding of Reynold's stepson and the 11-year-old Princess Isabella, the king's half-sister, was taking place in the castle. The Sultan hoped to capture the entire nobility of the kingdom. He brought a huge army, 9 catapults, and immediately began a furious assault. The defenders fought back desperately, but their strength was failing. The walls were crumbling under the blows of the siege engines. Messengers were sent to Jerusalem with a desperate plea for help. All hope was on the capital and the dying king. Hearing the news of the siege, the dying king made a decision that shocked the court. He announced that he would personally lead the army going to the rescue. The doctors said he would not survive the journey, The barons begged him to stay, but the king's will was unbending. He could not allow Saladin to capture Kerak. Thus began the most amazing campaign in the history of the Crusader states. The blind, mutilated Baldwin, unable to stay in the saddle, was carried at the head of his army on a litter. It was an unprecedented sight, an army led by its dying monarch. This tragic and majestic image made an indelible impression. The news that the king was personally leading the army spread throughout the country, and knights from all fiefs flocked to his banners. Even his longtime enemy, Raymond of Tripoli, brought his contingent and submitted to him without a murmur. The sight of him united everyone. The very fact that Baldwin was with them gave the warriors incredible strength. They were not just going to save a fortress, they were following their king, who had become a living embodiment of the idea of sacrifice and duty. This campaign had not only a military, but also a deeply sacred meaning. They were following the symbol of their faith and their kingdom. Saladin, learning of the approach of the army led by the king on a litter, was astonished. He well remembered the disaster at Montgisard and did not risk engaging in battle with this unpredictable and desperately brave opponent, whose name was already shrouded in legend. The approach of Baldwin was the last straw for the Sultan. Without waiting for the main Christian forces to arrive, Saladin ordered the siege to be lifted and hastily retreated. When Baldwin's army approached Kerak, they saw only an empty enemy camp. The fortress had been saved by the sheer force of will and reputation of the dying king. The victory had been won without a single blow of the sword. Baldwin was so weak that he could not even leave his litter to accept the gratitude of those he had saved. But he had fulfilled his duty one last time. He had shown that the true strength of a king lies in the unbending nature of his spirit, and as long as he was alive, the kingdom would not be conquered. This campaign was his swan song, his last great feat. Returning to Jerusalem, he finally took to his bed. His strength had completely abandoned him. He made his final arrangements, confirming Raymond's regency and ensuring the safety of his nephew, entrusting the fate of his kingdom to other, far less reliable hands. The last campaign had exhausted his life force. Leprosy entered its final stage, and the king's body turned into an immobile, mutilated mass. He was blind, could barely speak, but his mind remained clear and sharp, locked in the prison of his decaying flesh. His body was finally destroyed, but his spirit was still alive. He understood that his passing would be a signal for a new struggle for power. He used his last months to draw up a political testament, a desperate attempt to build a barrier that could protect the kingdom after his death. This was his last battle, which he fought not with a sword, but with the power of his mind. His main concern was the fate of the young, fragile, and sickly King Baldwin V. The boy was only 6 years old, and Baldwin IV understood that leaving him alone to face his ambitious relatives meant dooming both him and the entire kingdom to destruction. He tried to protect his nephew from the coming storms. Again and again, he summoned the haute cour to his deathbed. The barons and prelates gathered in his chambers, where the heavy smell of medicine and decay hung in the air, and listened to the will of the monarch, which he expressed through trusted individuals, most often through his loyal chancellor, William of Tyre. His decisions were dictated by harsh realism. He permanently excluded the despised Guy of Lusignan from any claim to power. He did not trust his own sister Sibylla either, knowing her boundless love for her husband and her insatiable lust for power. He removed them both, trying to save the country from their rule. He created a complex system of checks and balances. Raymond of Tripoli was officially confirmed as regent for Baldwin V. But to limit his power, the king's uncle, Jocelyn of Courtenay, who despite his kinship with Agnes remained personally loyal to Baldwin, was introduced into the Regency Council. The fortresses and military power of the kingdom were transferred to the control of the military religious orders, the Templars and the Hospitallers. Not being directly subordinate to the regent, they were to become an independent force capable of preventing any attempt to usurp power. The orders became the guarantors of stability in his will. The most far-sighted provision of the will concerned the future. Baldwin decreed that if the young Baldwin V died before coming of age, the question of succession would be decided not by the local barons, but by an arbitral tribunal of the most powerful monarchs of Europe, the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the kings of England and France. With this clause, Baldwin tried to kill two birds with one stone. First, he legally deprived Sibylla and Guy of the automatic right to the throne. Second, he desperately tried to involve the Western monarchs in the fate of the Holy Land, forcing them to take responsibility for its future, because without help from the West, the kingdom was doomed. In his personal affairs, he also showed nobility. He forgave all his enemies, took care of his loyal servants, and made generous donations to churches and monasteries. He prepared for death with the same dignity and courage with which he had lived his short and terrible life. He died as a righteous Christian monarch. In the winter of 1185, his condition became critical. The agony was long and painful. On March 16, 1185, Baldwin IV, the Leper King of Jerusalem, died. He was only 24 years old. His death, though not unexpected, plunged the kingdom into deep mourning. Even his enemies recognized his greatness. He was buried with full royal honors in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, next to his father and other Crusader kings. With his passing, an entire era came to an end. The last great figure of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, who for 11 years had held back the inevitable collapse of the state with his spirit alone, was gone. He left behind a carefully constructed but fragile structure of power. He had done everything humanly possible to ensure peace, but he could not change human nature. The lust for power, foolishness, and betrayal that he had fought against all his life had not disappeared. They had only lain dormant, waiting for his body to grow cold. The candle had burned out, and darkness began to fall upon the kingdom. The death of Baldwin IV was the stone that triggered an avalanche. His carefully constructed system of checks and balances lasted for an agonizingly short time, shattering on the reefs of human passions and ambitions. The subsequent events unfolded with the speed of an ancient tragedy, leading the kingdom to its inevitable doom. At first, everything went according to plan. The 7-year-old Baldwin V ascended the throne. As willed, Raymond of Tripoli became regent, who immediately concluded a new 4-year truce with Saladin, giving the kingdom a much-needed respite. It seemed that the will of the late king would be fulfilled. But the court party, led by Sibylla and Guy, had only been biding their time. Their hour came in the summer of 1186, when the little king Baldwin V, who had always been a sickly child, died in Acre. His death, perhaps not violent, was the signal for the conspirators to act immediately. With the child's death, Baldwin IV's will came into full force. The regency was to remain with Raymond until the monarchs of Europe decided who should have the crown. But Sibylla and her supporters, realizing that this decision would not be in their favor, were not going to wait. They decided to violate the will of the late king. They carried out a coup d'état. While Raymond was in his domains in the north, he was lured away from the capital by a trick. At this time, Sibylla, with the support of the Grand Master of the Templars, Patriarch Heraclius, and Reynald of Châtillon, seized power in Jerusalem, committing an act of direct betrayal and perjury. She proclaimed herself queen, but even her supporters in the haute cour agreed to crown her on one condition only. She had to divorce the universally hated Guy of Lusignan. They promised her that after the coronation, she could choose any new husband for herself, and Sibylla publicly agreed. During the ceremony in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Patriarch Heraclius crowned Sibylla. Then he handed her a second crown, intended for the new king. And at that moment, Sibylla made her fateful choice. She summoned Guy of Lusignan to her, and with the words, "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," personally placed the crown on his head. The barons loyal to Baldwin's testament were furious, but found themselves powerless. The kingdom was finally split. Raymond of Tripoli, in protest, went to his domains and even made a separate peace with Saladin. The state plunged into chaos, standing on the brink of civil war in the face of an imminent invasion. The new king, Guy, and his main supporter, Reynald of Châtillon, immediately began to pursue an aggressive policy. At the end of 1186, Reynald broke all truces by attacking a rich Muslim caravan traveling from Cairo to Damascus. This treacherous attack was the last straw that broke the Sultan's patience. Saladin demanded the release of the prisoners and the return of the plundered goods. But the weak and indecisive King Guy could not or would not force his vassal to obey. Then Saladin swore to renew the jihad and not to stop until he had taken Jerusalem. War became inevitable. In the spring of 1187, Saladin assembled the largest army the Muslim world had ever seen. King Guy also declared a general mobilization, gathering all the forces of the kingdom. Even Raymond of Tripoli, realizing the mortal danger, reconciled with the king and brought his troops. The two huge armies met in Galilee for a decisive battle. On July 4, 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, due to the catastrophic tactical errors of King Guy, the huge Crusader army was driven into a waterless desert, surrounded and completely destroyed. It was the most terrible military disaster in the history of the Crusader states. The army of Jerusalem ceased to exist. King Guy himself, the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedfort, and hundreds of barons were taken prisoner. Saladin kept his oath. He personally beheaded the treacherous Reynald of Châtillon. The entire ruling elite of the kingdom was either killed or taken prisoner by the enemy. After Hattin, the kingdom was left defenseless. Cities and castles surrendered to Saladin one after another. On October 2, 1187, after a short siege, Jerusalem capitulated. The dream of Baldwin IV, everything he had fought and suffered for, crumbled to dust just 2.5 years after his death. So what is the legacy of the Leper King? If judged by the final result, his reign could be considered a tragic failure. He could not prevent the split. His successors ruined everything, and the kingdom fell. But such an assessment would be superficial and deeply unjust. The legacy of Baldwin IV lies on a different plane. He became an eternal symbol of the fact that the human spirit, an unbending will, and a sense of duty can be stronger than any physical suffering, more terrible than any disease, and even stronger than death itself. In an age when the main virtue of a monarch was physical strength, he ruled while being a cripple. He was victorious while being at death's door. For 11 years, he almost single-handedly held up the entire shaky edifice of the Kingdom of Jerusalem on his fragile, disease-ridden shoulders, restraining internal strife and repelling the most powerful ruler of the Islamic world. As long as he was alive, Saladin could not achieve a decisive victory. As long as he was alive, Jerusalem remained Christian, and that means he gave his kingdom a whole decade of life, a decade that this state should not have had. This is his main achievement. His tragedy is that he was the last. After him, there was no one in the kingdom who combined royal blood, wisdom, and an indomitable will. The non-entities who came after him squandered in an instant everything that he had preserved with such superhuman effort throughout his short reign. The story of Baldwin IV is not a story of success. It is a story of great and tragic resistance to fate. It is the story of a boy who became a king who became a martyr, and a martyr who became a legend forever. It is a tale of how a dying candle in the darkest hour can shine brighter than the sun before it is extinguished. It leaves an eternal memory of its almost impossible light. So that such legends do not disappear into the darkness of oblivion, subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share your opinion in the comments. Your support lights our way.